My name is Dana Cho, and I am 28 years old. I was the first woman in my family to work in a corporate building. My mother pressed my blazer the night before my first day. She steamed the lapels twice, smoothed them with her palms, and stood in the doorway of our apartment in Koreatown watching me walk to my car with the particular expression of someone watching something they built leave the house for the first time. I thought about her face a lot over the next 6 months. Especially on the days when a man named Marcus Webb stood at the front of a conference room and made me feel like I had no business being in it. I want to tell you what happened in that room. But first, I need to tell you what happened 6 months later in the same room, with the same chairs, the same projector, the same 200 people, because that is the ending that makes the beginning worth sitting through. Marcus Webb was escorted out of that building on a Tuesday morning in March. He did not say goodbye to anyone. His badge was deactivated before he reached the elevator. And I sat in the third row and watched it happen the same way he had once watched me stand at the front of the room and absorb everything he threw at me. The difference was that I did not enjoy it. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because by the time it happened, I was so far past the version of myself that needed to enjoy it that I barely recognized him as he left. That is what 6 months of patience does to a person. It changes what you need from the ending. Before I tell you how we got there, take a second and tell me, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'm always curious who's on the other end of these stories. Now let me take you back to September and a quarterly strategy meeting and 7 minutes that changed the entire direction of my life. I had been at Hartfield Group for 3 years when it happened. 3 years of arriving early, staying late, eating lunch at my desk because the dry cleaning bill back in Koreatown didn't pay itself, and my mother hadn't asked me for help. She would never ask. But I saw the numbers and I understood them, and so I became the kind of employee who stayed past 6, because leaving at 5 felt like leaving money on the table. Marcus Webb had been Senior Director of Operations for 11 years. He had outlasted 4 CEOs. He had survived 2 HR investigations I only learned about much later, from people who had been there long enough to remember. He was the kind of manager who never raised his voice. That was what made him so precise. He had learned that calm was sharper than volume if you knew exactly where to aim it. I did not know any of that in September. I knew he was powerful. I knew he had never once acknowledged me in a meeting beyond a polite nod. I had taken that as a signal to work harder. That is the thing about being a young woman of color in a room full of people who look nothing like you. The silence of the people above you doesn't always feel like a warning. Sometimes it just feels like the cost of entry. Like something you earn your way out of if you're good enough. I spent 11 days on that proposal. A logistics optimization model I had built from scratch. I cross-referenced 3 years of delivery data with third-party efficiency studies. I printed 12 copies and stayed up until 1 in the morning the night before, rehearsing my section at the kitchen counter while my coffee went cold. I had run it past 2 colleagues earlier that week. Both of them called it impressive. One of them told me to send it directly to the VP. The meeting was held on a Thursday. Main conference hall on the 4th floor. 200 employees. Long rows of tables. The kind of room where people brought coffee and half listened and pretended their laptops were for notes. I sat in the 4th row on the left with my printed copies stacked in front of me and my blazer pressed flat, and my mother's voice somewhere in the back of my head saying, "You belong anywhere you walk into." She had said it so many times it had become a kind of reflex. I repeated it to myself twice before the meeting started. Marcus called on me 40 minutes in. What happened in the next 7 minutes, and I know the exact number because I counted them afterward, because I needed to know the precise weight of what had just been done to me, was one of the most methodical public dismantlings I have ever witnessed or experienced. I have replayed it enough times to describe it without flinching now. But I want you to understand that in the moment, standing at the front of that room, I was not calm. I was something very far from calm that was wearing the face of calm because I was a young woman in that room and I understood, somewhere beneath all the rehearsal, that I could not afford to be anything else. Marcus leaned back in his chair at the head of the table and asked me to walk him through my modeling assumptions. So I did. I was clear. I was specific. I had rehearsed this. He listened and he nodded once, slowly, the way you nod at something you've already decided about, and then he said very pleasantly, "What was your undergraduate institution again?" The room shifted. Not loudly. Just a degree. The way a room shifts when everyone feels the same thing at the same time and nobody is willing to name it. I said the name of my school. A state university. Not prestigious. Marcus let the name settle for exactly the right amount of time and then said, "Right." And then he tilted his head slightly and began. Because this methodology, and I don't want to be harsh here, this is the kind of work I'd expect from someone still developing their foundational understanding. The assumptions are incomplete. The data set is narrower than the scope requires. A pause. And honestly, Dana, I'm not sure you fully understand the operational context you're trying to model. He then spent 4 more minutes explaining why. Not to me. To the room. He invited 2 senior staff to weigh in, which they did, briefly, uncomfortably, because declining was its own form of career risk and everyone in that room understood the math of it. I stood there for all of it. I did not interrupt. I did not defend myself. At the end I said, "Thank you for the feedback." And I sat down. The meeting moved on. People around me found somewhere else to direct their attention. Not because they didn't care. Because they did, and caring felt dangerous, and so they filed it away under something they would think about later, and then mostly didn't. I went to the bathroom afterward. Not to cry, I want to be clear about that. I ran cold water over my wrists for 3 minutes and looked at my own face in the mirror and said, out loud, to no one except myself, write it down. Then I went back to my desk. I opened a new document on my personal laptop, not the work system, my own machine, and I titled it one word. Record. Here's the thing about the kind of woman who grows up watching her mother work double shifts and say nothing because gratitude doesn't complain. That woman knows how to wait. That woman has been practicing patience since before she understood what patience was. I did not make a dramatic decision in that bathroom. I made a quiet one. I was going to pay attention. I was going to write things down. I was going to be precise about what happened, when it happened, who was in the room, and exactly what was said. And I was going to do that for as long as it took until what I had was so undeniable that no one could look away from it. The document started with September's meeting. Date, time, location, number of people present. I reconstructed the conversation as close to verbatim as I could. I noted the specific phrases. Foundational understanding is a different thing than needs improvement. One is coaching. The other is a public statement about whether you belong in the room at all. I captured the difference. I would keep capturing the difference for 6 months. Over the following weeks, Marcus's patterns became visible. He always performed in front of an audience. He always waited for presentations because witnesses amplified the impact and simultaneously made the thing harder to report. Nobody wants to be the woman who can't take feedback in a group setting. Nobody wants to hand someone the word difficult. He rotated his targets enough that no single person could easily identify a pattern. And he always maintained the language of development. High standards. Investment. Wanting you to grow. I documented 12 incidents in the first 2 months. Not all directed at me. Several aimed at colleagues. I noted those too. I had become, without drawing any attention to it, a very careful observer of whatever room I happened to be in. If you've ever been the kind of woman who worked twice as hard just to be taken half as seriously, I want you to pause this story for just a second. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever stayed quiet in a room where something wrong was happening because speaking up felt more dangerous than absorbing it? I read every single one. Hit that subscribe button before we go any further, because what happens next is the part that changes everything. Now back to month 3. In month 3, an analyst named Priya had a presentation dismantled in a smaller team meeting. I watched it happen. I watched her gather her materials afterward with the specific, deliberate slowness of a woman refusing to let her hands shake where anyone could see it. I recognized that slowness. I had performed it myself. That evening I sent her a message. Not about Marcus. Not about what had happened. I asked if she wanted to grab coffee and talk through the Q3 modeling approach because I had some thoughts and genuinely valued her perspective. We got coffee. And somewhere in the second hour, carefully I said, I've been keeping notes on some patterns I've observed in meetings. I don't know if it's useful to you, but I wanted you to know that someone noticed what happened in there, and I don't think it was your work. Priya looked at me for a long moment across the table. What kind of notes? She said. That was the beginning of month 3. By month 5 there were 6 of us. Me, Priya, a logistics coordinator named James who had been with the company for 8 years and had watched his career plateau in ways he had always quietly blamed on himself. 2 analysts from the Chicago satellite office I had connected with through a LinkedIn message phrased carefully enough to be completely innocuous to anyone who didn't already understand what they were reading. And a former employee named Rosa who had left the company 18 months earlier under circumstances nobody had ever fully explained. Rosa responded to my message within 4 hours. She had kept her own records. She had kept them in a drawer at home for 18 months, telling herself she would probably never use them because that is what most people decide when the system has already shown them, in various ways, that their experience is not considered sufficient evidence of anything. She sent me 11 documents. The case, which had been building steadily, became airtight in an afternoon. I want to tell you what it felt like to open those files. It was the same feeling I imagine you get when you have been quietly constructing something in a dark room and someone finally turns on a light. The shape of what you built is suddenly visible. And it is bigger and more complete than you realized. 11 years of incidents. Dates, locations, witnesses. Exact language documented by multiple people independently arriving at the same patterns. Performance data showing the correlation between Marcus's targeted behavior and the subsequent departure of high-performing employees. A portrait so clear and so consistent that no reasonable person reviewing it could call it coincidence. We had a case. And none of us had done anything except pay careful attention and write things down. And then, at the beginning of month 6, everything shifted in a direction I had not fully prepared for. Marcus found out. Not specifics. Not names, not the folder, not the documentation. But something had reached him, the particular instinct of a man who had spent 11 years reading rooms and managing alliances. Something in the atmosphere had changed and he could feel it. I found out on a Wednesday morning when I was pulled into a one-on-one meeting that had not been on my calendar 48 hours earlier. Marcus was pleasant. He was always pleasant. He talked about my recent projects with what sounded like genuine interest. He said he wanted to make sure we were aligned. He expressed concern about my trajectory. And then, at the very end, very casually, as if he had just remembered it, he said he had heard I had been having some conversations, and that he just wanted to say, as someone invested in my growth, that informal coalitions in a professional environment could sometimes be misread by leadership. A warning wearing the clothes of mentorship. I thanked him for the clarity. I walked out. I sat at my desk for 4 minutes without moving. And then I sent one message to the group. He knows something. We move up the timeline. What Marcus did not account for, what he could not have accounted for, was that by warning me, he had given me something. A time-stamped, documented record of a senior director demonstrating preemptive awareness of a protected activity and subtly implying that participation in that activity might have professional consequences. Without a single overtly threatening word, he had done something that looked very much like retaliation. I added the Wednesday meeting to the record. Verbatim. With timestamps. Then I called Priya and James and the others, and we finished what we had been building and we submitted it. The company's anonymous ethics reporting mechanism required board-level review within 30 days of submission. I had read the ethics policy 17 times. I knew which provision required escalation above the HR function. By going directly to the mechanism, we bypassed Marcus's network entirely. Our joint document was 83 pages. The board reviewed it in 9 days. On the 10th day, a mandatory company-wide meeting was scheduled. 4th floor conference hall. I arrived early. I chose the 3rd row, close enough to see the front of the room clearly, but not the first thing Marcus would see when he walked in. I had thought about this. I had thought about almost everything. My mother had packed me lunch that morning. I had driven home the Sunday before, and she could tell something was different about me. Not in a worrying way. Just different. Steadier. She pressed a container of rice into my hands when I left and said something in Korean that roughly translated to eat before the important things. She had no idea what was coming. She just knew her daughter had come home with something solid behind her eyes, and that rice was the thing she knew how to offer. I ate it at my desk before the meeting started. Marcus arrived 3 minutes before it began. He took his usual seat to the right of the podium. He looked composed. He had probably convinced himself that whatever had been building had been managed. That 11 years of institutional protection would hold. That the machine would protect him the way it always had. The CEO walked to the podium. She did not look at Marcus. She spoke for 4 minutes. About the company's values. About what those values required of leadership. About a review process conducted thoroughly and independently. And then she said Marcus Webb's name, and she said the review had concluded, and she said his employment was terminated effective immediately. She said it clearly. Without hedging. In a room of 200 people. With the same flat, measured precision that Marcus had used on all of us at one point or another. I watched his face from the 3rd row. There was no dramatic collapse. No visible breaking point. There was something almost worse, a very slow recalibration. The composure he had spent 11 years constructing held for approximately 4 seconds after the announcement. Then the edges of it began to come apart, very quietly, in the specific way that a face changes when it finally understands that the thing it had considered impossible has already happened without warning. 2 people from HR walked him out. Nobody clapped. The room was very quiet. But it was not the quiet of shock. It was the quiet of relief so large it hadn't found a sound yet. The quiet of 200 people finally exhaling in a room where someone had at last said out loud what everyone had been carrying alone. Priya was sitting 2 seats to my left. She exhaled slowly. I heard it. I didn't look at her. I looked at the front of the room and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in 6 months, because feeling it would have made the waiting unbearable. I had been right. The thing was real. And it was over. 3 months later I was promoted. Not with a company-wide announcement, just a quiet conversation with my new director and a title that finally matched the work I had been doing for 2 years under a manager who had made it his business to ensure nobody noticed. Priya was asked to lead the project that my original methodology had been the foundation of. The one Marcus had called undergraduate-level in front of 200 people. James got a meeting with the chief operations officer he had been requesting through proper channels for 2 years. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. 3 of his proposals were implemented within the quarter. Rosa received a formal written apology from the company. She told me it wasn't enough. I agreed. She also said it was something. I agreed with that too. Marcus Webb's LinkedIn came down within a week of the dismissal. He has not worked in this industry since. The story travels the way these stories always travel, not loudly, not all at once, but through enough people who lived inside it and remember precisely how it felt. The company updated its ethics policy. Mandatory bystander training. A new reporting channel that doesn't require going through direct management. Small things maybe. But things that did not exist before a 28-year-old woman with a personal laptop and 11 days of original work and a very specific kind of patience decided to open a blank document and write one word at the top of it. My mother still doesn't know the full story. I've told her enough. She knows something happened at work that was hard, and that I handled it, and that I got promoted on the other side. She told me I had always been too stubborn to stay down. I didn't argue. The night the promotion came through, I drove home to Koreatown and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the bathroom on the 4th floor. The cold water on my wrists. The 7 minutes I had stood at the front of a room and absorbed things that had no business being directed at any person. And I thought about the document I had opened after. The single word at the top. Record. That word was the whole strategy. Not anger. Not an explosion that would have cost me everything and changed nothing. Not the loud confrontation I had drafted 100 times in my head on the drive home that September. Just write it down. Be precise. Be patient. Let the pattern become undeniable. And wait for the moment when the truth no longer needs you to fight for it, because it can finally speak for itself. If you watched this entire story and felt something move, if you recognized the room, or the manager, or that very specific exhaustion of being dismissed by someone who has already decided that women like you don't quite belong where you've worked to be, I want you to hear this. You are not imagining it. And you are not alone. The women who genuinely change the rooms they work in are rarely the ones who storm out of them. They're the ones who stay. Who document. Who find each other quietly. Who build something undeniable out of what someone else assumed would dissolve without a sound. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever stayed quiet in a room where something wrong was happening because speaking up felt more dangerous than absorbing it? What would you have done differently if you had known then what you know now? I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you, subscribe to this channel. Every week there is another story like this one. Real women, real rooms, real patience that rewarded them in ways the people who underestimated them never saw coming. Karma is not always fast, but it is thorough. And we will be here every single week to show you exactly what that looks like.